Welcome to Distro Podcast.
Okay, on today's episode of the Distro Podcast, we've got Mihir Pershad with us. Mihir is the CEO of Umami Bioworks. Mihir, welcome.
Thanks for having me. Happy to be here.
Awesome. Mihir, this is about you. We'd love to get to know you, hear about yourself, your background, some of your experience, anything you're willing to share. So I'll hand it over to you.
Yeah, absolutely. Maybe I'll start with a little bit of my background and how I got into startups in the first place, and then what we're doing now at Umami. So I started, I think, on probably what would be considered like a pretty traditional pre-medical kind of path. Studied biochemistry, started working on like traditional academic research, found that really interesting, but pretty quickly got disillusioned with the pace at which like the academic world moves, which I think it can be a common feeling. But that kind of was juxtaposed for me with an experience starting a nonprofit with some friends while I was in school. And actually, we started just doing some things, and we were distributing equipment to schools. And somebody said, "Well, okay, if you're going to do anything with kids, you've got to actually have registration, licenses, all this kind of stuff." And I think as the least resistant to figuring out all the business stuff, I sort of took on a lot of that, and found that I was like really much happier in like a fast-paced environment where figuring things out from the first time without a roadmap in front of me. But I really wanted to still do science. And so I was thinking about like, how do I find a career where I can do fundamental science that leads to real breakthroughs, but also work at a pace that's not academia, and ended up finding myself at a startup studio, one of the early studios that was working on deep tech. So we were working on, and it was in Baltimore, Maryland, basically taking IP out of universities and national labs and building companies around it. And I did that for 4.5 years. And that was like the most fun that I've ever had in maybe a traditional job working for someone else. Because sort of doing something different every day, working across multiple different companies in early stage, getting to just solve problems, but it's not the kind of problems you solve when you get to be a big company. It's just like troubleshooting and finding a path every day. But 4 of the 6 companies that I helped build while I was there were related to seafood and problems with disease management, things like diagnostics, vaccines, that kind of stuff, which I didn't know really anything about before going in. And I realized there was this whole opportunity in like biotech applied to food that felt very under-invested in, both in terms of actual capital, but also in terms of the number of smart people going into the food system versus going into other places. It feels like it's not an attractive destination. And so that to me was like I had discovered a place where I could add a bunch of value and potentially have high leverage and impact, because it felt like I'd stumbled onto a hidden secret, that there's these huge problems in the food system that we'll need to solve in the next 20 or 30 years that no average conversation with somebody who was entrepreneurial, tech oriented, like was not talking about. And that led me to Umami, which was built on this premise that the seafood system needed to double roughly from 2020 to 2050. And doesn't really have a way to do that if we stick to just current methods. And the idea with Umami was, why not just grow the cell, take the idea of growing the whole animal out as an obvious necessity and say, what if we just grow the edible parts? And we do that in a way that's separated from the limitations of seasons and geography, and basically be able to do it in a contained environment. The same way that vertical farming has been able to solve some of these problems for other kinds of ag, with more complexity for sure on the technical side. But that fundamental idea, I think, was really interesting to me. And I think, have found a niche in these endangered species that can't really be farmed at scale, because the customer has that problem, being the big food company, but the consumer also has that problem. So everyone's interest in the value chain is actually aligned in a way that's not obvious when you're trying to bring disruptive technology into an established industry.
That is fascinating. So your guys' mission, or like kind of the your objective, it sounds like, is to leverage modern technology to fabricate, make certain types or parts of like seafood, or make seafood out of certain cells for parts of like these organisms' body parts. Like, is that what I'm understanding?
Yeah, so basically we grow like the stem cells from a shrimp or a tuna or an eel, some of the species we're working on, and then kind of create the end blend of muscle and fat that gets the right flavor and nutritional profile and everything else. And then we figure out what people don't like about the existing products. So, often tuna comes with a mercury problem. A lot of fish now comes with a microplastic problem. We can address those and deliver something cleaner, but that still meets the flavor and nutritional expectations. And nobody has to catch a fish and fly it halfway around the world to get it onto your plate, which I think is the big long-term win, is that we can do it local to consumers, even if they live a few thousand kilometers from the ocean.
Very interesting. So maybe help us understand, like, what's the technology that you're, what are you guys building to accomplish this?
Yeah, so Umami's approach is basically to try to build like the AWS equivalent for biomanufacturing. So try to build the platform that both helps people develop tools and develop products, and then also the scale up side, because we think those two problems are connected. And there's a lot of biotech companies that sort of built development tools, machine learning, AI based, like discovery of new drugs. But then the way that we make those things has been kind of stagnant for at least a generation, and it keeps costs really high. So our approach is kind of, you can think of it in three buckets. There's biology, there's software, machine learning, and then there's hardware. And we kind of build at the intersection of those three. So on the discovery side, it's kind of applying machine learning to the basic biology to figure out how to pick the best cells so they grow the fastest, they have the best nutrition and flavors, how to feed them the most efficiently, and figure out what conditions they like to grow in as fast as possible. So you can go from customer request to scale ready biology in as short a time as possible. And then the other side of that is, we don't want to build one factory. We want to build 1,000 with customers owning and operating them around the world to reach meaningful demand. But there aren't enough skilled operators to run 1,000 factories around the world. And it takes a long time to train somebody to be that level of skill to run like a new facility from the ground up. So then taking basically the same idea on machine learning and applying it to a standard plug and play modular design for a production line means that we can increasingly automate and take that complexity away for the producer. And then ideally translate what we're doing in R&D into plug and play production for a customer. So like a traditional food company could put our production system in, say, I want to make tuna, I want a second line to make salmon, and then you're off and running, and it's integrated directly into your downstream packaging and shipping, infrastructure that you already got.
That's so interesting. So help us understand, like, what's it like? Where are you guys based out of, and what's it been like? Building this company. How long have you been at it? Maybe help us understand some of that information.
Yeah. So we're a little bit over 4.5 years into Umami's journey so far, and I think it's interesting because I think every company has its own life. Some companies you can build to close to their peak in 5-6 years, especially if it's like a specific, simple, elegant point solution. Some companies are multi-decade, and I think we're definitely in that latter category because we're going to be building a whole new category around us. So I think we're still very early on that journey. But we are headquartered in Singapore, but we've now got operations in India and Japan as well. And between those locations, we're kind of doing basic R&D.
You said Singapore, India, and Japan. You've got all your people, and okay. Very cool.
Yes. Yeah. And we'll have some in the US probably within 2025. So we're growing quite global. I think we sort of work across 4 or 5 different areas. So you need culinary people, marketing and category builders, cell biologists, and biomanufacturing people. And the talent hubs for those things are in very different places globally. So we've sort of tried to find this balance of finding the best hubs globally to build while recognizing that biology doesn't travel well. And so there's a need to try to limit how go to hubs as opposed to be properly distributed, because if you're spending money with FedEx shipping cell lines around all the time, that's not really a great use of investor money as opposed to doing actual research and doing the product development. And we are now, first product should be in market early next year. We've got a couple of them and a few big food companies in the pipeline working on bringing these to market with us. Our goal is really to be, you're saying AWS, we want to be in the background. We want the customer to actually have their brand out front, because customers have brands that consumers already know. They're big established food companies people have been buying from for decades. So
yeah, that's awesome. So you've got 3 kind of hubs right now, likely going to expand to the US. How many people do you guys have working with you that you've assembled over the last 4 years?
Yeah, so we'll be at about 20, 21, 22. We've actually just gone through kind of a wave of hiring, but a lot of the people won't start till a month or two from now. But I think we've been a very lean team, and we haven't raised a ton of capital for how much we're doing right now. Partially because I think when you're doing deep tech, one of the worst mistakes you can make is raise too much too early and misalign your investors' incentives with the company's incentives and finding the right market and the right entry point. So we've tried to be pragmatic about not doing that.
Smart.
But certainly when you're doing expensive R&D, it's nice to have more money laying around to be able to do things as opposed to not. So
yeah, venture capital's changed, right, in the last couple of years. It's a different beast to tackle. But so you've got 20 to 25 people. I imagine you guys are also continuing some growth. Finishing up this year and going into the new year.
Yeah. So I think for us right now, the name of the game is get first products at least into the market with a very clear timeline and geography, and then figure out what on the ground support is needed to kind of deliver on that. I think the next big wave of growth for us will be an ops team to actually help deliver factories to customers. That's a whole set of work we haven't had to do yet. But when you're trying to deliver a factory as a product, there's a whole new set of challenges that go into how do I actually do handover and support a customer when things inevitably don't work exactly as you planned up front. So
yeah, I can only imagine. That sounds like a challenging hurdle to cross, but something I'm sure is going to be exciting for you guys. So let's transition a little bit. Let's keep going this way of like you're building the team, building this company. So you guys have 20, 25 people or so. You said mainly across like 4 different types of like roles, it sounds like. What's it been like building this like core foundational team over the last few years? Is it, walk us through like how you've gone about doing that, and do you have some like key players that you've brought on that you just are like, man, that was a very fortunate hire. Like, can you help us understand all that?
Definitely. So, I think we started building a simpler org. So when we started building, it was basically, let's build just the upstream R&D, solve some of the basic problems. Can I actually get a cell out of a tuna? Can I grow it? And figure out how to grow it on cheaper and more sustainable ingredients, and get it to some minimum scale where we can start actually making prototype products people can eat and get feedback on. And that was like the first 2.5 years of the journey doing that. So we have a couple of our early hires were some of the most important, which I think is typically the case. It sort of lays the foundation for the kind of people you want to bring in. And so like our head of media development now and our head of cell line development were 2 of the first couple of hires that ended up being, I think, still today, two of the most important hires we've made so far, because they are like, they're scientists, but they also, I think, have more empathy for the fact that the science has to be done in service of like a commercial outcome. And actually, one of those two hires left academia because they wanted to see their work turn into something meaningful in the world, which speaks to me because that was one of my reasons for stepping into the world of startups. But I think it's also just really important. Like, it's really hard to hire good scientific people, especially if they're coming out of academia, and know for sure that they're going to make the bridge over to industry and a startup well. And I think luckily for us, those early senior team members made that jump quite well, and can now set that tone and like echo, I'm not the only voice saying how important it is that we do things that the market cares about, right? It's not just doing science for its own sake. The interesting challenge now is, as we've moved in the last 12, 15 months from let's prove that this can work to how do we actually get it into a customer's hands in a way that they pay us for, which is kind of unique in deep tech because most companies can't go 2 years without having that conversation. But in deep tech, you almost have to get far enough that a customer can see something tangible to have a real conversation with you. And you go from internally directed R&D only to now we have to listen to customers, and what you think of what the customer thinks are different. What you think may be important may not be important to anybody that I know right now that I've asked yet, which means it should go on the back burner until we find a customer interested in that particular research area. So I can give you one example would be if you're developing a tuna and you think producing just fat that makes tuna belly very tasty for sushi is exactly the right way to go. And then the customer says, but I want to sell my tuna as high protein. And I want the fat for the flavor and everything else, but I want to hit a certain protein target. That's a whole dimension that maybe internally directed we weren't thinking about. And having sort of senior R&D folks willing to make that journey and listen to a commercial team member saying, this is what I'm hearing from customer, is like one of the first major shifts that we've gone through. The next one will be like an engineering shift of saying customer wants it, R&D can deliver it. Is it scalable, repeatable, like dependable, or do we have a lot of volatility in process at scale where now the engineering person is sitting at the table saying, I need you to give me more stability. And so now you have, everyone loves constraints, I think, to some degree, because like engineers love them because you can only do creative design when you have constraints. But for scientists, where the biology is not, it's not like writing code, right? You're sort of finding your way through, but the biology kind of does what it wants sometimes. Now you have multiple competing sets of constraints and have to make sure that there's an org where there's harmony of everyone understanding you have your priority, but at the end of the day, saying I want it and not knowing if it can be delivered has to be a collective conversation. And you're adding kind of new layers of decision making and balancing of interests as you grow.
Yeah.
So
yeah, no, that's super interesting. What I'm hearing from you are, correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm hearing two core components of like how you've been building your team, which is this like foundational team, which is like one, like core values, culture fit, making sure that like you said, these scientists that you brought on, they shared an attribute or a thought process, a core value that you had, which was science is cool and research is great, but like, let's actually have it become something and be something that can make a big impact in the world. And sharing that is pretty cool. And I would imagine that's not, like you said, I imagine it's very uncommon to find scientists that think that way. And then the other component is like overall alignment to your mission or your objective. You mentioned like finding, there's going to be some people in the company that are just very technical and whatever that looks like for their role. and then others that are more visionary like yourself, and forward thinking and progressive, and making sure that you guys are all aligned to move forward at a fast pace in the same direction. Like you can almost, give up a little bit of like experience when and who you're hiring when you've got someone or a team that's so aligned in those two things. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yeah, well, I think it's always interesting too when you're in a field that is kind of truly frontier and doesn't have a one-to-one analog in the existing world. Like, experience comes in different flavors because nobody's actually done the exact thing you're trying to do. It's not like if you're building enterprise SaaS, you can hire the guy who has sold $1 billion enterprise SaaS, pipeline and can come in and replicate it. It's like you're hiring a guy from pharma who has to retain some of what the technical know-how is from pharma, but lose the stuff that won't fit the cost structure in food. And everything is like that. Everywhere we look, you want people to bring some things and have the mental flexibility to let go of others. And that's incredibly difficult because usually the more senior and more experienced you get, the more you think, I've built a playbook, let me just execute it. I think that can be really, really tricky. So we always try to find people who have experience, but are intellectually curious enough to sort of be willing to understand how what they're doing now is different from what they've done in the past and might require different things of them. And I think as long as everybody on the team shares that kind of core value, then people show up trying to understand what's different and how they need to adapt, as opposed to projecting their experience and just saying, this is the way that I know it works, so let's do it this way. Which I think can easily get you into a lot of trouble. If you're hiring people from an industry with a cost structure 1,000x of what you need to hit, you can do a lot of great work and be 100x too expensive.
No, yeah, that makes sense. Okay, last question on this topic specifically, or I guess second to last. You've got these 3 hubs expanding into a 4th. Like, how have you gone about finding talent and building teams in these hubs? Because they're in different countries.
Yeah, it's not the easiest thing in the world, I'll say. And this is something that's relatively new for me because I was mostly building in the US before. So also learning about different markets and the quirks, I'll say, of like workforce, culture, ways of working, and like pitfalls of knowing what to look for in different countries look pretty different. Like one example, I think for those who maybe have been to Japan, like you kind of really see there's a very strong preference for harmony and the system over the individual that looks very different from like an American culture, which is a very individual driven culture. And when you have a startup, you want people to be, every person owns some piece of something, and the desire for harmony can't overtake doing the best thing for the company at that point. Or in a lot of Asia, you'll see deference to senior team more than you would see in Western countries, in my experience. And so I think a lot of that has been trying to at least establish a playbook for when we hire, what's the 1 or 2 things we have to have, particularly in a certain market where those things may not be super common, to make sure that the team can actually communicate on a fundamental level across multiple locations and not have like cultural whiplash. But I think the other thing is that I found really has worked for us is also hiring key senior team members and not having them all be in one place. Like if we had kept the whole senior team sitting in Singapore and built 3 additional hubs, I think that would look very different in terms of also how the team perceives where's the center of gravity, where's all the power in the organization. We've tried to make sure that some of the senior members, like some of our senior R&D team sits in India. Japan is still a very small office for us right now, but eventually some of our key commercial people for the Japanese market and maybe even Asia will sit in Japan. And it creates, I think, a very different sense of like every part of the org is doing something important and not exactly the same thing, but they all fit together. Because I think you can run into this, and I think a lot of companies have seen this. Like in a lot of ways, training a scientific org to think remote first is very difficult
I
because
imagine.
science is a creative act, right? And so, but like it is and it isn't. But the creative bits are people chat over lunch, they have informal conversations, and ideas come up, and some of that is near impossible to replicate because people are not at their computer all the time. So if they're even when they're not remote, they're in the lab, and so creating forums for like that more spontaneous discussion across production or different sites physically when people are not really at their computers most of their day is kind of an interesting problem to solve for. Uh, and I think making sure that there's not then this feeling that I'm on the Singapore team where you're doing product development and two of your team members are in India, two are in Singapore, one's in Japan. Your team is actually spread across those three sites. I don't know if we've fully solved that yet. I think we'll see how it evolves. But I think if four people were in Singapore and one was in India, that would be a much worse dynamic, right, than having it across multiple places because the one person would always be the odd man out in culture and an exposure to kind of spontaneity and the like.
Yeah, like you said, it's different in like just like straight software technology because everyone's on their computer all day. So conferencing, messaging, communication, it's a lot easier to streamline communication and therefore, as a byproduct, like maintain a decent culture even with everyone being distributed and remote. So in a scientific setting, I can imagine it's a very different setup. So having core leadership in each hub, that's genius. It's great. I think that alone is going to help keep things connected across all these distributed teams. As we wrap up on the podcast, this episode, what we always ask for our guests to share is for you to share one either word of advice or lesson learned in building, your foundational team of like key players.
I think the biggest thing I've learned, kind of having done this a handful of times now, is make sure that there's kind of alignment or harmony of vision and how each person can contribute to it. Because you almost never, except unless in really rare circumstances, kind of assemble the whole senior team at once. Like in rare situations, you can get 3 or 4 founders that cover all the major bases together, and you don't really need to add a senior person to that team for a while. But in every other case that I've seen, it's kind of piecemeal. And so bring people in. I've had multiple people tell me like senior hires are hit or miss. You get 1 out of every 2, which seems like a kind of very frivolous way to talk about a 50% failure rate in really critical hires where you lose a ton of time and money and momentum getting that wrong. And I think the biggest thing that I look for is like, does this person understand where they can add value to that group and feel like they could plug in and just keep running in that same direction with shared alignment? And if you can do that and that person has roughly the technical chops, I think they can figure out how to actually execute it. But I think it's easy to overhire for this person has the exact experience I'm looking for, super technically talented, but I'm a little bit hesitant on how aligned that actually is, in terms of mission and culture fit. And that can really, I think, fall apart very easily.
Oh yeah. I mean, everyone's some of the best people I've ever hired. I've hired like by their DNA, right? Like not technically their DNA, but like, just their personality and the way they think. And, when interviewing, we try to ask like strategic questions to learn how they, if they take ownership over a tough situation or a bad situation, or how they react to something unexpected, and things like that. And like you mentioned, if you keep that aligned to what your mission is, what your core values are, you're going to find people that maybe not may not be as senior in their experience, but they'll figure that stuff out, and they likely will be 10x better of a hire than someone that had all the exact direct industry experience. So that's great. That's great advice and lesson learned. Wonderful. Well, Mihir, it's been great getting to know you. Thank you so much for being a guest on this episode. We'll go ahead and wrap up with that. Everybody listening in, Mihir Pershad with Umami Bioworks. It's exciting. We're all gonna, I'm sure, be impressed with what we see you guys come out with over the next couple of years. So thanks again for joining.
Yeah, thanks for having me.